Hi, good afternoon. My name is Susan Packard Davis, and I'd like to welcome you to ThinkTank Learning's first live webinar. The topic today is going to be how to study smarter. Not necessarily longer or harder, but how to study smarter. Before I talk about the actual topic, I'd like to give you a little background information about me so you know who I am and why I actually know what I'm talking about. My name is Susan Packard Davis, as I mentioned. I'm a senior consultant at the Pleasanton Center for ThinkTank Learning. I went to UCLA as an undergrad many years ago and skipped a year of high school to be able to enter UCLA while it was still the 1960s. So that gives you an idea of how old I am. I was a history major and spent a great portion of my time during my university years doing political work. It was the time of the Vietnam War and the rising women's movement, and I was very active in both on the campus and off. Consequently, when I graduated UCLA, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something in the community, but I really didn't know what. So rather than jump into something I didn't want to do, I decided to teach at the school that my mother had started in 1973, a small, very rigorous college preparatory high school on the west side of Los Angeles. And I loved teaching. I felt natural doing it. I enjoyed it very much. I taught history and English, a senior seminar in social history and American literature, and I enjoyed it. But I also decided that I still wanted to do some work in the community, so I decided to go to law school. And I did go to law school in Los Angeles at Loyola Law School, and took the bar and passed it the first time, luckily. But I kept teaching all that while as well, to make a living and also because I loved it. After I passed the bar, I started representing tenants in Santa Monica, and then later was appointed to the Santa Monica Rent Control Board, which had just begun in 1979, a work that I continued for 10 years. Again, that was work that I did for the love of it. We really didn't get paid for that work. It was work I did from the heart, and I loved doing it, and I did it until 1990. In 1982, however, the person who'd been helping my mother run the small school left. And so she asked me, since I had by that point become a fixture there, whether I would like to run the school with her. And I jumped at the chance. I thought, wow, this would be great. So I took over being a co-director with her and started teaching myself college counseling from the ground up. Granted, in 1982, it wasn't that complicated. There weren't that many people applying to college, and it certainly wasn't anything like it is now. But I did develop my own methodology, working at it year after year, and I continued working at the school and running the school for nearly 30 years. So by the time I finally left in 2010, I had come up with a system that really worked beautifully to help young people get into the college or university of their dreams. And the methodology involved creating a portrait of the student, an honest portrait of who that person really is, what they love to do, and how strong they were as students and how strong they were outside of school. It's very similar to what ThinkTank does, and that's why when I came to the Bay Area and found ThinkTank, there is no ThinkTank in Southern California, I decided to work here. And I do the same thing now that I've done for over 30 years. I help each student develop their talents, develop what makes them different and interesting and unusual, and then help them communicate that to admissions committees via their applications and particularly via their essays, which is something I love to do. I spend a great deal of time editing essays, obviously, in the work that I do, and that's my first love. My father was a writer, my mother was a professor, and I grew up in a house full of books and words, and I love to edit, so I do a great deal of that. All of that is very necessary now in the kind of world that we're living in. The colleges that most students want to attend or dream of attending have admissions rates now that have fallen so low that, frankly, for someone who's been doing it a long time, the way I have, it's almost unbelievable to me. When my younger brother went to Harvard in the 1970s, mid-70s, they probably had something around 10,000 or fewer applicants for the same number of seats they have now, which is, I think they admit about 2,000 or 2,200 to get a yield of about 1,600 students. The number of seats hasn't changed, But now they get almost 40,000 applicants for the same number. So you can see what's happened to the admit rate. This same is true for the public universities. The top public universities like UCLA and UC Berkeley have admit rates now that have fallen into the teens. The schools haven't changed that much, but the number of people applying has expanded exponentially. And so it becomes even more important for students to distinguish themselves among the vast numbers of people who are applying. And there's two things you can do. There's two things a student really can do, and this is what I always tell them. Distinguish yourself, become someone important in the class and outside of the class. And it means not just doing things that benefit you personally. It means taking what you love to do and sharing it with the community, becoming someone who's important outside the classroom as well. So what can a student actually do to stand out from the crowd? What can a young person do these days to make sure that an admissions committee will notice them and that they won't be just the same person taking the same courses, getting the same grades, doing the same things as everyone else? It's what I have always told students. Do what you do at the highest level, in school and outside of school. In school, that means taking a very challenging curriculum and really working hard at it. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. It means taking a course of study that maybe is different from other people. Maybe you take a foreign language that not many other people take, or if your school allows, maybe you take 2 foreign languages. When I ran my own school, I had many students taking 2, sometimes even 3 foreign languages, and I'm sure when admissions committees saw that, they saw a dedication to an area that was unique, that was different. A student can also distinguish himself or herself, and should, outside of the classroom. Do something important. There isn't one right thing to do. I'm going to talk more about that as well later. But pick something that you love. A student should pick something that he or she really wants to do, and then do that at the highest level as well. Be a leader. Be someone who's an initiator. You want to be someone who's unusual, and I mean that in the best sense. Someone who is not like everyone else for all the right reasons. That brings me to the main topic that I'm going to be discussing about how to study smarter. Many parents tell me that their students spend a lot of time studying and yet don't get the results they want. They tell me their students spend hours and hours at night staying up, going over what they think they should be going over, and then the next day when they go to school and take the exam, somehow it doesn't come out the way they want. When I hear this from parents and sometimes from students, I always ask the same question. It's the same question I've been asking for 30 years. Tell me how you study. What do you do when you study? Just tell me. I want to know exactly what you do when you sit down to study before a test. And I always get the same answer, and it sounds something like this. Well, I look over my notes. I read the textbook. Then I look over the problems we did in class, and then I look over my book again. And then I always say to them, is that all you did? You looked it over and you reread your notes and you reread your textbook? And they always say, yeah, that's what I did. And I did it for hours. I said, but you didn't do one thing. You didn't do the main thing that is going to make your brain remember that material. You didn't do anything physical with your hand. You didn't write it. You didn't type it. You didn't work out those problems again. You didn't underline. You didn't do all the things that will make your brain remember. I learned this lesson very young when I was a very small child and studying. You have to do something physical. These days there's a lot of ways to do that. You don't just have to take pen to paper. You can take notes in your phone. You can take notes on your computer or your tablet. But you have to do something like that. And you can't take a shortcut. Instead of just looking over the problems from your geometry class or your AP Calculus AB class, work the problems out again. It's going to take a little more time at first, but you'll get better at this methodology. And instead of spending lots and lots of time just looking stuff over that isn't going to make a difference, your studying will be very pointed and you will be very specific and you will remember it. When you get to the test the next day, your brain will remember working out those problems again just the night before, or your brain will remember underlining those passages in the book. I know you can't write in your books in a public school, but you can photocopy the pages and take notes into them and underline them. There's no one right way to do this in terms of notes or doing something physical. Each person has to work out a system that works for him or her. When I was in law school, I developed a very elaborate note-taking methodology of taking classroom notes into the outlines for the course. So I had everything in one place when it was time to study for the finals, which was of paramount importance in law school because there's only one exam a year. You don't get any other chances. So I wanted everything in one place. If someone else looked at my notes, I'm not sure they would make sense. I had little stars and arrows and all kinds of things to make me remember, but it worked for me, and that was the important thing. So there's no one right way to do it. You can't graft someone's system onto someone else. But I encourage all my students to take great notes in class and develop a system that works for them. And then when they study for the test, almost take the notes again, recopy them, underline your own notes, highlight them, do something physical. Your brain will remember it. I always ask my students after they've tried this for a couple of rounds of exams if they see a difference, and they always tell me, my God, I got such a better grade on that test. Oh, it was so much better. And it really does work. So that's one of my points to tell all of you. The other thing that a student can do in terms of studying in a way and doing work in school that will make a difference, as I alluded to earlier, is to take a curriculum that stands out. It depends what you want to do with your life, which area you might want to specialize in, or if you really don't know yet in high school, that's okay too. But don't shrink from taking difficult courses. Colleges like to see students who are courageous. I still think to this day that it's better to get a B+ in a difficult course than to take only the easy courses. If a college admissions committee sees a student who has straight A's, but they didn't take the harder courses, they got straight A's in all the easy stuff, that's just not as impressive as taking at least some hard courses where they had to work harder, think harder, and where maybe they didn't get a perfect grade, but at least they met the challenge. And perhaps if it's an AP course, when they take the AP exam, they'll do beautifully on that. So it gives you another opportunity to show what you know. So I'm always encouraging students to be courageous. I think it's a good way to go. The other important thing about studying is when you do it. A lot of students have a lot of activities that they're involved in, so sometimes they can't study right after school. But if a student can, I always encourage them to do it directly after school instead of waiting till 2 in the morning. It's good after school, have a little snack, run around the block, do something physical, and then sit down and study while the day is still fresh in your mind and while you still have some energy left in the tank to do it. The worst thing to do is to put all your studying off until after dinner, where you get a little sluggish and a little tired with a full stomach and you pass out on your books, or you kind of zone out for a while and then come back and realize, oh my God, it's almost midnight and I haven't finished. That's the worst thing you can do. The other thing is to do the subject that's hardest for you first. Don't put that one off to the end. If you are great in English but math is giving you some difficulty, start with the math homework, because you want to be able to spend more time on that when it's fresh in your mind from the day's lesson. And if you put that off to the end, you're not only doing the most difficult thing last, you're doing it when you have the least amount of energy, and you're not going to probably do as great a job on your homework, and you probably won't remember it as well, particularly if you have to study for an exam. So you should do that one first. Another question that parents always, or it isn't really a question, it's more of a statement. They say, I've created this perfect study environment for my child. They have this great room and this desk and everything's wonderful, but they don't seem to really study very well there. They get distracted, or they're constantly coming out of their room. So I always tell students, try to find a neutral zone to study in, a place where there are no emotional distractions as well as physical ones, like a think tank center perhaps, or a Starbucks, or a Pete's. When I was in law school, there were no such coffee houses. There was one small one in Santa Monica that I used to go to, and it was great. I mean, you can go to the library if you want. A library was a little too quiet for me. I liked to be where there was a little bit of noise, but where I was separate from it. I didn't want to feel completely cut off from the world in a library, but it needed to be quiet enough. But the good part of it was that it was a neutral place. I didn't know anybody there. I wasn't going to be bothered by any distractions, and I could just focus on my work. So that's really one of my most important points that I make to students about where to study. And then finally, a lot of students, when they come to Think Tank, get some tutoring help in various subjects, which is wonderful. We have an incredible group of teachers who can help students if they're struggling in a subject or if they just want to refresh in a particular area. But again, the student has to make the material his or her own. It's not enough just to go to a tutor and then think, okay, I'm done with that. I can go right in tomorrow and take the test. After you leave the tutor, you must go home and study some more because you have to make the material your own. It's not enough just to get some help and think that's going to just help you glide through the test the next day. It won't. You have to go home and put in the time yourself. But if you follow the other rules that I mentioned about studying smarter, you'll find it's not really such an imposition, and you'll get a much better result on the test the next day, and you will feel that as though the time you spent wasn't wasted. It wasn't hours and hours spent in useless endeavor, but it was time well spent that's going to help you do better the next day. I've pretty much talked now about what you can do in school in terms of how to study smarter and better. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what a student can do outside of the classroom to distinguish himself or herself as a human being in the community and as someone that colleges would like to have at their campus, someone who would become an important part of that world as well. A lot of parents think that a student must do certain things. There's really no one right thing to do. A student should not choose an extracurricular activity because their aunt told them to do it, because their mom thinks it's a good idea, or because everybody volunteers at a hospital. If you don't want to volunteer at a hospital, you shouldn't volunteer at a hospital. You won't like it, and you won't do it to the highest level. Just like your schoolwork, it's important to do your outside the classroom work to the highest level. You want to be a leader. You want to be someone who initiates things. You may want to start a project of your own, and you won't do something like that if you're volunteering in an area or working in an area that you don't really like. So you have to choose something you like or hopefully love to do. And then once you've done that, rise up in it. Rise year after year. If it's a club at school that you're involved in, the first year I know they don't let students really become leaders too much. You kind of just have to go to the meeting. But plan on, as soon as you have the opportunity, becoming a leader. Take an initiative to help plan an event. Do something important. You never know where those things are going to lead. Every time you put yourself out there in the world, something good might come from it. You might meet someone who later will say, gee, I saw that student organizing that event, or I saw that student at the event, and I decided I would like to have him or her work for me. You never know where those things will lead. And each step that you take is like a stepping stone to the next level. And so if you're going to be in a club, first pick a club in an area you like. Don't join speech and debate if you don't really like to speak in public. Don't join the Model United Nations Club if that's really not your thing. Maybe if you are interested in healthcare, you'll join the Red Cross Club or something like that. So pick what you love. Again, there's no one right thing to do. In terms of outside activities beyond clubs, again, pick organizations or venues to volunteer in that make you happy when you're doing it. I never had a volunteer hours requirement at my school because I think volunteering should come from the heart. I wanted students to do it because they enjoyed it and they wanted to contribute to their communities. I didn't want them to do it just to rack up a certain number of hours. So try to look beyond the hours and think, how would you like to spend your time when you're not studying? If given the opportunity, where would you go? Would it be to a library? Maybe it would be to a hospital. Or maybe it would be something entirely different. I've had many students over the years become very involved in a group that I love very much called the YMCA Youth in Government Program. My younger brother was actually youth governor of California in the 1970s. That's how I learned about the program. And the YMCA is a wonderful place to get involved in, not just in youth in government, but in a lot of their other programs. And again, you don't know where it might lead. While you're participating in youth in government as perhaps an elected, a kind of a student elected official, and a speaker comes to speak to the group, an actual real elected official, you may have a conversation with that person. You may develop some kind of relationship with that person and end up wanting to intern for that person. And they might remember you because they met you at that meeting. That's the kind of connections you want to make when you're doing your volunteer or your extracurricular work outside of the classroom. The wonderful thing about volunteering, when you do it from the heart, is that you put yourself in an environment in which you'd like to be. And because of that, great things can happen. You never know where it might lead. I have a couple of interesting examples to give you about that sort of volunteering. I had a student years ago who wanted to be a neurosurgeon. His dream was to go to MIT. He really didn't want to go to any other university. I helped him volunteer at the local hospital, which happened to have a really great volunteer program. And he just started out like everyone else, introducing himself into that program, going to the orientation. But instead of just doing a little of it or doing it maybe once a week, he decided, since this would be his life's work, that he would really devote himself to this local hospital. And he became a fixture there. He started out in the emergency room and spent some time there. The doctors and nurses got very comfortable with him and recommended him to other doctors and nurses throughout the hospital, who then had him actually interact with the patients, which was rather unusual for a young man of his age. And he was only 16 at the time, but they were giving him true responsibilities because he had distinguished himself there and shown them that he was capable of that. They wouldn't let him obviously do any procedures, any medical procedures, but he could be with the patients while that was going on. And he did this for 3 years. It was a sustained, long activity that really contributed, again, to his picture, to his portrait. This is what he wanted to do with his life. And I'm sure it was one of the things that certainly helped him get into MIT, which he did. He didn't know where it would lead when he just stepped into that hospital. But he didn't stop at the idea that he would just spend a couple of hours a week in the emergency room and leave it at that so it would look okay on an application. He devoted himself to it. And that's what happens when you do something that you love. Doors open. One of the doctors there wrote him a beautiful letter of recommendation when it was time for him to apply to college. Again, something extraordinary. Doctors where the students volunteer don't often do that because they don't get to know them that well. But he made sure everyone knew him very well. Another great example of that is actually my younger son, who in the late part of 2007 decided he would volunteer for the Obama presidential campaign almost before anyone even knew who Obama was. And so he went down to the local office. He was only 15 years, actually he was still 14 at the time. And he said, "I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll just sit here. I know I'm not very old, but I'll work on the phone. I'll do anything." Luckily for them, he was very well spoken, so they put him on the phone. And little by little, he became a fixture in that office. He spent every waking moment that he wasn't studying in school going down to that office and volunteering. And where that led was that he became so good at it that by the time he was 15, they actually asked him to go to the Texas primary as the representative of that office, even though he was only a teenager, to work on the Texas primary, which he did. And then later, because of that experience and the recommendation of the local chapter, he became the youngest Obama organizing fellow in the entire country at the age of 15, which I'm sure helped him get into all the wonderful universities he got into as well. He later became a Regents Scholar at UC Berkeley. But again, it shows you, he just had the notion that he would go down and volunteer because it's what he wanted to do. He wanted to support that campaign, and he devoted himself to it. And one door opened, then another door opened, because of his efforts and his dedication. But then another door opened. People took note. People watched. And that's what happens when you volunteer like that, when you put yourself in an environment you want to be in and you do it to the highest level. That's the whole point. Do what you do and do it the best, and doors will open for you. Another question parents always ask me is, does my son or daughter have to play sports? So I always ask them, the next question I always ask is, are they good at it? Usually the answer is no, not very. Or I ask the student, do you like that sport? Sometimes they say yes. If you like doing the sport, even if you're not very good at it, keep doing it because you enjoy it, and it's great to do something physical like that during the day. But if you really don't like doing it and you'd rather just take a walk yourself, then don't do sports. Sports really only help students so-called get into college if they're those very special recruited athletes. Other than that, it's just a piece of your picture. But if you're not really a sports person, trying to force yourself into it is just going to make you miserable. So I don't advise people to do that sort of thing. If you like it, though, keep doing it. The same thing holds true for musical instruments. You don't have to play a musical instrument in order to apply to college. If you do play one and you enjoy it and you want to keep doing it, by all means do it. If you are in the orchestra at school and it's part of what you do every day because it gives you something and you also enjoy doing the concerts and giving back to other people so they can hear your beautiful music, by all means keep doing it. Again, it's a piece of your picture, and it may be something unique. Maybe you play a unique instrument. I helped a young woman get into UC Berkeley many years ago who was a tuba player. There aren't many young women tuba players. It's a really big instrument, and she was not a very tall, big person. I'm convinced it helped her get into the school. She actually ended up in the band there. So look for things like that. If you do play an instrument and it is an unusual one, that's great. But even if it's the one that everybody plays, try to play it at the highest level. Try to become first chair. Again, assume a leadership position in what you do and do something special with it. In addition to those kinds of activities that a lot of people do, a student who's really interested in distinguishing himself or herself will want to do something unique, a special project in the area that they love. There are a couple of examples I want to give you of students I had in years past who did really extraordinary projects. And again, it came out of something they wanted to do, and they just found a unique way to do it. So here are a couple of examples of students I had in years past who developed their own projects and their own ways of doing something that they love to do. I had a student probably about 10 years or so ago who wanted to do something important for students in public schools. She attended my school, which was a private school, even though we had probably about 40% of the school on scholarship that the school funded. That was important to me. But there weren't that many people in the school, and she wanted to help students at other schools who didn't quite have all the options that she had. And one of the ways that she wanted to help was to help young people who wanted to go to their prom, young women who didn't have the proper shoes to wear. This was something she felt was very important to young women of her age. I personally was not a big prom person, but this was something she felt would be important to a lot of young women. So she actually organized her own nonprofit corporation called A Walk in Your Shoes. And she got shoe companies and actual individuals to donate new shoes to her nonprofit corporation, which she gathered together and then distributed at many different public high schools in the Los Angeles area. She did this for the her two last years in high school. It became a big deal. She had a board of directors of all students from the school. It was a non-computer era, so we didn't have a tech person on that board of directors, but she had everybody else. And they organized the shoe gathering. They made contact with all the corporations. They made contact with the various public schools and organized the distributions on those campuses. It was really quite a remarkable project. I'm sure that when she was accepted at all the wonderful universities where she was, it was not only her extraordinary academic achievement that helped her get in, but the fact that she had organized this extraordinary project and sustained it. She kept it going for 2 years and even bequeathed it to other students when she graduated. She was accepted at Cornell, she was accepted at UCLA, I think also Berkeley. It's been a while, I can't remember, but she ended up going to UCLA. And she was really quite something. She did also happen to play a musical instrument. It was her voice. She was a singer as well. So her picture, her portrait, was something really extraordinary. It was something that admissions committees took note of. Her academic work was strong. She took 2 foreign languages. She took Latin and Italian, which was wonderful. She had this wonderful nonprofit corporation that she had developed all on her own, and she was a singer. That's a great picture. That's a picture of somebody you would like to have on your campus, I'm sure. So that's one example. There was another young woman that I had at the school who loved journalism. We didn't have a large school newspaper, just a small enterprise because the school was small, so she wanted to branch out. So she did some research on her own and found that there was a youth newspaper in Los Angeles at the time, it doesn't exist anymore, called LA Youth. And she applied to them to be a reporter. And she showed them some of her writing samples, and they took her on. So she was a youth reporter for youth, I think it was called LA Youth, not Youth LA, for a couple of years. And one of her and she used to tackle important articles, important subjects. She didn't just write fluffy articles about, everyday items in high school. She tackled big subjects, vouchers in schools. She tackled racism in schools, racist issues that came up during those years. She tackled sexism. She tackled a lot of things that other school newspapers maybe wouldn't touch. One of her articles garnered the attention of an editor at the Los Angeles Times who approached her about working for them as a youth reporter. So actually, she was a youth reporter for the Los Angeles Times in her last year of high school. She also was accepted at a wide variety of universities. Her GPA was not the highest in the world. She had some struggles with math over the years, but she was strong in the areas that she needed to be, and she had this extraordinary background in journalism. So she too was accepted at UCLA, where she decided to go, and she was taken on by the UCLA Bruin as a reporter, a full reporter in her freshman year, which is very unusual. They usually don't do that. You usually have to kind of be a cub reporter for a few years. So again, you never know where anything is going to lead when you put yourself out there, but if you do what you love to do and you do it at a high level, something wonderful will happen. And you will become a better person for it. You will become a person who's grown from the experience, and you will also be someone who will become extremely attractive to colleges and universities. You'll be the kind of person that they would like to have on their campus. And that's my job, to try to help people become that sort of person and then communicate that they are that sort of person to the colleges and the universities that they apply to. So thank you very much for being part of ThinkTank's first live webinar. That concludes my portion of this section, and my colleagues are going to be speaking on some other topics related to what I've discussed, so please stay tuned for that. And then after all the presentations are done, we will be conducting a live Q&A session, and I'll be available to answer any of your specific questions about your son or daughter, or perhaps about yourself. So thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll talk with you soon.
Hello, my name is Stephen Horban, and I'm the Chief Instructor for ThinkTank Learning's Millbrae Center. Today I'd like to talk to everybody about how to study more efficiently. In this day and age when we have so much competition for academic effectiveness, going to colleges, UCs, private schools, the question becomes, how many AP classes should I take, how many extracurriculars should I have, and how, of course, do I fit all of this stuff into my very busy schedule already? Now, I've seen many different types of students at this point in my career. Having worked with the company for about a year, I've met all the students who've gone from 2.0 GPAs, wanting to get 4.2 GPAs, students who want to go ahead and get the 2400 on the SAT, or simply pass an ACT with a score of about 28. Now, the bottom line is that no goal is unrealistic, but it comes down to a question of, do you have the work ethic? Do you have the discipline and the willpower necessary to achieve this? Now, when it comes down to strategizing, it comes down to dealing with students of all different types. This makes the question, or rather the answer to the question of how should I optimize my studying time, really kind of difficult to acquire. No student should think that there is a single set course for what it is they want to do. And again, having dealt with AP classes, things of science versus English, languages and math, history, really you can't treat all of these courses the same. Now we'll talk a bit about what courses you should be taking towards the back end of this conversation, but first I really need to come back to how do we optimize your time. If you're in school for about 8 hours a day, maybe you have sports afterward, music lessons, who knows, you have a task ahead of you that is very difficult. You need to make sure every single minute, if every single hour, is spent effectively learning. Now, before we start talking about actual specific tactics you might adopt to bolster your study habits, I want to go ahead and dispel some ideas people actually have about how to study. I like to refer to these things as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, let's go ahead and get the bad news out of the way first. One of the things you should not do, one of the ugliest things you can do, is rely only on your tutors and teachers. Now, of course, I myself am a tutor. I work with students all day, but the bottom line is that I'm not here to make sure everything goes exactly as it should for you in school. I am here to help you out, to improve your study strategies and possibly give you some new ones if you happen to need them. But don't rely on a single person to enact your entire strategy to execute where you should be executing. Aside from not having a plan, the next worst thing you can do is try to cram for things like tests or exams, or think that you really have plenty of time for something like a 2-week project, when really you should have gotten going the second it was assigned to you. Now, I've seen a lot of students do this. I've had plenty of students come through my doors asking, Steve, I've got an exam tomorrow. I've got an AP test coming up in a week. Teach me everything there is to know about this topic. I'm sorry, my friend, it's not going to work. You should have talked to me about a month ago, if not longer. So please, 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 for the sake of your teachers, tutors, and of course your parents, stop cramming. It doesn't work. You simply won't retain enough information to be successful. Now, if you have to take several different classes, if you have several different problems in front of you, one of the last and worst mistakes you can make is to treat every challenge the same. Whether it's an AP course or an ACT or SAT exam or a TOEFL exam, regardless of what the task you have at hand is, don't treat them all the same. Don't apply even all the strategies I might teach you today to the same problem. You need to be able to think for yourself, what is the best tool in my toolbox to use to solve whatever issue happens to be in front of you? Now that takes care of the ugly. These are some of the worst offenses I've seen, some of the worst problems students have faced. There's still some bad ideas people have about studying though. Let's go ahead and get to those. Now, believing that there are types of people in this world. Everyone likes to say, well, I'm not a math person, I'm not a science person. Oh, I'm great at history, but English not so much. Or, what was that book about anyway? I didn't get it. I'm not an English person. This is a mistake. Don't think of yourself as a type of a person. There are no types of people in this world. The bottom line is that people have strategies, people might be a little more talented in certain areas, but there's no reason that because you were born into a certain family, born into a certain area, that you can't pick up a new subject, run with it, and be great. So stop thinking that you can't be a math person. Think about it this way. There are plenty of scientists in this world. There's plenty of artists as well. Many artists might say, well, I could never pick up algebra, all those numbers, X, Y, and Z. Who knows, who cares? Do you really think there's scientists in the world who say, I never got Beethoven, Shakespeare, who could ever figure it out? Generally not. Again, don't limit yourself. Now, aside from that, people also think, I have to take on all the AP classes. I need as many extracurriculars as possible to bolster my college resume. Not true. Sometimes less is more. Never go overboard. Never put too much on your plate, because there's a problem with being a jack of all trades and a master of none. Getting a 3.0 GPA when you have all AP classes is not as impressive as perhaps a 4.2 when you've only got 3. Again, know your strengths, know where you're going to go with these things. Try to apply different strategies for the classes, as I kind of mentioned a moment ago, but the bottom line is that less is sometimes more. Now, that takes care of the ugly stuff, the bad stuff. Let's get to the good stuff, right? Now, as far as what I've seen that's good, you want to go ahead and be adaptable. I mentioned before, don't take the same tool out of your toolbox every time for every class. You need to be willing to change your strategy, which is something that a lot of students don't want to do. You're already bogged down with classes, you've got so many extracurriculars, as I've mentioned a moment ago, and so it can be difficult to really try to sit down and critically think through the challenges you're facing in an AP Biology course, as opposed to, say, an AP US History course. But the bottom line is that these are two very different animals. You don't hunt two very different animals with the same lures, right? So remember, be adaptable, be ready to change, okay? Now, one final issue. Ask for help. Too many of my students come to me with questions they could have gotten answered by their teachers. The issue is that you're in a class full of 30 students. It's busy, you have a lesson plan to get through. I realize this. But many teachers are available outside of class, and students simply don't think or aren't willing to talk to them. They're people too, they're humans, like you and I. Go ahead and give it a shot. If you're really stuck on something, if you have no idea what's going on, you don't necessarily need to talk to me. Talk to your parents, talk to your teachers, talk to your friends who are in the same class with you, but make sure you're asking questions. Make sure you're getting the help you need, because when the test comes along, it's ink on paper. It's not going to tell you anything you hopefully don't already know. Now, something that I mentioned a moment ago, which I really need to drive home, is that idea of being adaptable, being able to change from course to course. Let me give you a quick story about a student who initially wasn't able to do this. Her name was Sarah, and I met her about a year ago. She was just making that really difficult transition from middle school to high school. Now, her parents at the time weren't worried. There was no problems, because in middle school, she'd been a straight A student. Across the board, no class, no amount of extracurriculars could slow her down. Sarah was a machine. Things changed in high school for her, though. By the end of her freshman year, she'd gone from, well, what should have been a 4.0 GPA to roughly 2.2. Her parents didn't know what was going on. They asked her constantly, Sarah, can we do something? Sarah, can we help you? What's going on? What's happening? Sarah didn't know either. Sarah said, I'm studying hard. I'm studying hard. I'm trying so hard for you, Mom and Dad. I don't know what's wrong. problem was that Sarah hadn't adapted to high school. In high school, the workloads are going to change, the subjects get a greater level of depth, and here she was employing the same tactic she had in middle school now that she was in high school. And that tactic is something that, well, many students, even in high school, continue to apply: rote memorization. Now, if you're not familiar, that means she would read a textbook, read an assignment, read a worksheet, whatever it was, over and over and over again until she memorized it. But here's the problem with that approach. It doesn't lend itself to a depth of understanding. When it came time to actually apply these ideas, Sarah really had no clue how to extend these things, how to go ahead and take something she'd read in a textbook and bring it to life on, say, an exam for short answer questions, or in an essay. She was at a loss, because no matter how much she memorized, she couldn't build anything with that. Now, when I started to work with her, I saw this almost immediately. And the problem here is that most students don't think there's another way to tackle these problems. Her self-confidence was in the gutter at this point. She didn't know what was going on, didn't know how to fix it. This is something that, if it's not caught, can affect a student well into their later years, especially in college. And you've taken a student who should have had great potential and left them somewhere a little less than where they should have fallen off to. But now, let's talk specific strategy. I'm talking class-to-class kind of stuff, which hopefully you can go ahead and employ to do better and study better. Now, one across-the-board strategy, which I hope all of you going forward will employ: study groups. Now, you're probably familiar with the concept. Maybe you're not really executing at this point. That's okay. Let me tell you this. In college, my friends, you will be using this concept all the time, because in college, most people are across the board having difficulty with the class they're taking. Study groups are when you're going to bring your friends together, people who you happen to meet through these courses you're taking, to try to put your minds on the same problem. Whether it's a really difficult exam coming up or a really difficult project which you all have to manage, the bottom line is that 2 heads being better than 1, well, 3, 4, or 5 would be even better. It also helps to know what you know and know what others know. In other words, the things that you forget, they might have remembered. So in other words, think of your friends, other students, as a possible backup to whatever it is you might have missed or simply not have been paying attention as closely as you should have to in class. So another tactic that many people have heard before, of course, flashcards. Why have you heard about this so many times? Because it works. Now, as far as flashcard applications go, usually language classes, some science classes, or history courses are the best options for where to employ this specific strategy. Flashcards typically you want to associate with concept building or vocabulary building. Many times they're not going to be great for things like math, unless you're really talking about a very specific application. Something like physics, which has a lot of formulas to remember, almost borrows a lot of algebra in many cases, can be difficult to pin down with flashcards. However, those courses I talked about a moment ago, which do have the concepts, events, and vocabulary that can be fit on that little card, these are things you want to begin building libraries for. Things that you want to hang on to from the start of the course all the way to the end. In many cases, you're going to be dealing with cumulative exams, large projects, difficult finals. Having these kinds of libraries at your disposal can help mitigate the challenge any of those assignments will possess, or pose, rather. Finally, something that I would know from very personal experience. If you really want to know something, you really want to learn something in and out, through and through, teach somebody else. As a tutor, I've found that my own education has been improved 100-fold. Having to actually think about even simple concepts, which I mastered, well, more or less, a long time ago, to students who need help. Teaching others gives you the chance to realize what it is you don't actually know. And furthermore, it can improve your confidence with a given subject. Learning. I'll give you a quick example. I had a student in AP Biology, a junior by the name of Jonathan. This was a little under a year ago, I believe. Jonathan came to me in about the middle of his AP Biology course. He'd been doing okay, but was really only at about a B- in terms of his grade. He had done extremely well with CP Biology, but now was finding the more complicated concepts, the more complex topics, were really kind of throwing him for a loop. While the grade was one thing, something I noticed about Jonathan was that his confidence was really lacking at this point. The fact that he was finding so much difficulty with a topic he had previously done so well with was really setting him kind of in the gutter. Now, working with Jonathan was no problem. I teach AP Biology all the time. The problem, though, was he kept second-guessing himself. This was a reason for his tests continuing to plummet while his homeworks were fine. His homeworks he would come in with, and he would have plenty of answers, many of them the correct ones, but he would always second-guess himself. And it was up to me to go ahead and say, no, you're absolutely on the money with this one. But I couldn't be there when it came time for his exams. I realized that Jonathan saw me as a tutor, which is helpful, but I was supposed to be encouraging. I was supposed to tell him that he could do this. It wasn't my words that he needed at the time. Then I ran into Amy. Amy was actually taking CP Biology at the time. She was struggling with some similar concepts that Jonathan was having trouble with. At this point, I brought the two of them together. During a joint session, I had Amy begin to ask me questions about things I knew Jonathan knew. And then, rather than simply answering them or helping her to better understand the answers, I tagged Jonathan in. Jonathan began to go off in a way that I hadn't seen him. He went up to the board, he had diagrams, figures. He was actually answering more and more of Amy's questions. I just stood aside because after about 10 minutes of his explaining things and Amy just picking up one concept after another, I had Jonathan just look at everything he'd put up and everything he just told her. He knew this stuff, and now he knew that he knew this stuff. The bottom line is that sometimes teaching others not only helps us to better understand a topic, but it helps us realize just how deep our understanding really goes. From that point on, Jonathan became much more apt to answer questions without asking me first whether or not he was correct. Even though he continued to make some errors along the way, his tests began to turn around. His scores went up, and he didn't always need me there in his head telling him he could do it. He knew he could, and Amy helped him do that too. This brings me to the next part of our conversation, choosing the right AP classes for yourself or your student. I realize that it can be tempting to take as many AP courses as possible. It looks good on your transcript, and of course, you get something of a grade bump if you're doing pretty well. But less can be more. In this case, I want to dispel some myths that people might have in their mind about choosing AP courses. The first, and probably the one that I have the most difficulty sometimes with, is that a solid GPA determines one's success in AP classes. You might have a student who's doing very well, 3.5 to 4.0, and this is with their college prep classes. AP can be very, very different. Simply saying that someone did well in CP Biology doesn't, for me, guarantee their success with AP Biology. Is it one of the indicators that they'll do well? Absolutely. Does it guarantee that they will do well? Not for a second. So, you must be very careful in choosing your courses. At the very beginning of this talk, I said something about knowing the material and knowing the teacher. This is hopefully information you can get even before you're in the class to give you some better idea of just what kind of challenges you're going to face. Myth number 2, high school counselors can predict success. High school counselors are great people, but they have a job of dealing with sometimes hundreds of students. Their job is to say whether or not you're meeting prerequisites. In other words, do you have a supposed foundation for building this understanding of a given topic, like biology or chemistry or physics? While they can be helpful, they are, again, no guarantee of success. Trusting your counselor entirely with the full weight of the decision of whether or not to take an AP class, frankly, is a mistake. It's not something you want to do. Do your own research. Just because a counselor says you have the prerequisites to do something doesn't mean you'll be successful. And remember, one bad AP course, one difficult struggle can threaten all of a student's other classes. Myth number 3. Well, everyone else is taking the AP course. My students' friends are doing it. People I don't even know are doing it. Simply because everyone else in the school is taking that AP course, supposedly, doesn't mean that it's going to be a great fit. Would you argue that your son or daughter is exactly like every other student in school? I don't think you would. You'd like to think they're unique, they're special. They're maybe stronger in some areas, weaker in others. The bottom line is they are an individual. Simply because other students are taking these courses, whether it be your student's friends, or it be other parents who are telling you about this, don't necessarily rely on that kind of bandwagoning idea to determine whether or not your student will do well. Again, make sure you put some of your own thought in this. It's a very, very crucial decision, one that will affect your student and potentially yourself in terms of the stress they get from school for some time. Now, things to watch out for. We've talked about the myths. Let's talk about some information you're absolutely going to need. Number one, drop deadlines. If you haven't heard of these before, they're the final point in time when your student can safely be removed from an AP or other advanced class and return to a college-level course. Again, there will be a specific date and time after which your student will have to remain in that advanced course. If you know beforehand, before this drop deadline, that your student needs to be excused, needs to return to a college-level class, be ready to make that call. Again, be very clear about when the drop deadlines are for a given advanced preparation course. Now, aside from knowing the drop deadlines, what are the red flags you're going to be looking for? Do you know when your student is going to be doing poorly? Can you follow very accurately the grades they are getting in their courses? This, to some extent, has to do with the teacher of the course. In some cases, they may be a little slow in updating your student's school loop or other online network, which follows your student's grades. It may be that your student doesn't quite tell you exactly what's going on in class at all times. As a result, you're going to have to make sure you have established red flags to look for. Furthermore, what are you prepared to do when those red flags do come up? Do you have a plan in place? Are you certain you can ensure access to other education for your child, whether it be tutors or teachers or other elements which should be able to improve your student's grade? Do you have those lined up? Are they ready to go? Remember, drop deadlines, look for your red flags, and know whether or not you will be able to help your student succeed when he or she starts to fall. Again, choosing the proper AP courses and choosing when to remove yourself from them is something that every student and possibly parent may have to consider at one point or another. I'm dealing with a case currently that unfortunately shows how devastating some of the wrong choices can be. Two students, Danielle and Cheryl, great friends, they know each other, I know them as well. Both of them enrolled earlier this year into an AP Language and Composition course, in other words, an AP English course. Now, at the very beginning, the very first day, they were given an essay to write. This essay was on philosophy, something which neither of them really have too much knowledge about. Danielle said she felt pretty overwhelmed by the essay assignment. Cheryl, not so much. She went ahead and plugged away at it. Danielle did her best too. However, when they got their scores back, Danielle clearly showed that she was struggling a bit. Now, when it came time to deal with that drop deadline, Danielle consulted her parents, and together they made a decision to remove her from that class. She went back to CP English and actually is doing extremely well right now, roughly a 3.8 GPA last I checked. Cheryl, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot more of. Cheryl, while she remains in the AP Language and Composition class, has told me she feels somewhat overwhelmed by the workload. An essay every week is not uncommon for this kind of class. This is something that neither she nor her parents had really anticipated, and as a result, I understand that some of her other courses are suffering as well. The bottom line is that it is not the end of the world to remove yourself from an advanced preparatory class. In some cases, it's simply the right decision to save the grades you get in other classes, other areas. Again, because of this kind of workload, an advanced class really can throw something of a wrench into the works. You need to make sure you're crystal clear about what you're going to be getting into going in, and you need to be ready to get yourself out of it if need be. Again, my name is Stephen Horban, the Chief Instructor for ThinkTank Learning's Millbrae Center. I hope you've enjoyed our webinar and found it extremely useful for either dealing with your students' current workload or possibly planning for some of those advanced classes down the line. Now, please hang in there, and if you want to check online, we have a downloadable checklist that'll be used to assist in some planning for your student and generally help them to cultivate some of those strategies I talked about earlier. Finally, we have a live Q&A coming up in which you can go and ask questions regarding how do you plan for your student, what should your student be doing right now, and whether or not we can be of any use to you. Thank you.